Hello, sir. Hi, Zach.
Yep, that's me.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Very good. Yeah. How about me?
Sounds good. Looks good. Okay, thank you so much for your time. I so appreciate it. So tell me first, just okay, talk about what happened between 2010 and 2020.
I guess maybe just to take a quick step back,
Yeah.
just introduce myself. So, yeah, I'm Zach Rausch, Associate Research Scientist at New York University, and I'm the chief researcher for The Anxious Generation, which was written by John Haidt at New York University. The book tells the story of what happened to the generation, the kids who were born after 1995, and we call them Gen Z. And Gen Z is really different from the generations that came before them in terms of their mental health outcomes, in terms of learning performance, in terms of all these different dimensions in the book. And what we're trying to do is understand what happened to this generation. And in particular, what we find and what the book is focusing on is how child development and social interaction changed, specifically and most acutely between the years of 2010 and 2015. And we call this period the Great Rewiring of Childhood. And it's the period that kids moved from having flip phones, didn't have high-speed internet in their pockets, didn't have an Instagram account, um, didn't have an unlimited data plan. And by 2015, they had all of that. And then suddenly you're now living 24/7 in a virtual world, connected with everyone and everything. And this new infusion into what we call a phone-based childhood has been what we believe really detrimental to young people's mental health and also the ability to pay attention, to focus, and thus having big impacts on learning as well.
What was so shocking about Gen Z that we needed to look at the cause here?
So for decades, we were seeing general improvements in many measures of mental health outcomes or things just relatively steady among American teenagers. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, self-harming behavior, they were generally pretty steady and sometimes even improving. And then right around 2012, so between 2010 2015, we see this sudden hockey stick, sorry, we see a sudden hockey stick shaped curve in graphs from many different data sets showing a huge uptick in self-harming behavior among young preteen girls ages 10 to 14, large, more than doubling increases in depression and anxiety, even in suicide as well among young people. And that was the beginning phases of what we saw was something really started to change in the early 2010s. And then I saw that the same thing was happening in the UK, in New Zealand, in Canada, in Australia, many similar trends across the Nordic countries and across Western Europe. We started to notice that something fundamentally changed in the lives of young people in the early 2010s. And this was not just happening in a small pocket in the US, this was happening across income, across race, across cultures. And the book is trying to explain what happened to young people's mental health.
What about those who say, well, it's a correlational cause, it's not cause and effect?
So the first thing to note is that there are a few debates happening around this issue. The first is the scale and the scope of the mental health crisis among young people. And there's generally grown to be a consensus among researchers that there is, in fact, a crisis of mental health among young people. The Surgeon General has been very loud about this issue. And the second question that kind of comes logically after that is what's driving this crisis? And there have been a lot of different researchers, a lot of different debates. And what we point to in our book is a tragedy in two parts. It is the loss of childhood independence and free play in the real world. In other words, overprotection in the real world. And then a rise in the just infusion of digital technology, in particular smartphones and social media, that drive many different kinds of harms. And this is what we call underprotection in the online world. So overprotection in the real world, underprotection online. And those two forces is what we believe drove the crisis. So that debate about, is this the correct explanation for that problem? It's a contentious one, but there is growing consensus that one, there is a correlation between social media use in particular and mental health outcomes. And that relationship is stronger when you look in for adolescents and you look in for what's happening to girls. And this is the cohort that has been hit most strongly since the early 2010s. And we're developing now much more extensive experimental evidence of showing what happens when you reduce your social media time to 10 minutes a day or not use it at all for multiple weeks. And what we're finding consistently is that when kids are able to spend less time online, more time out in the world, mental health starts to improve. And so there's a growing body of evidence. It's still a matter of academic debate. But what we find is that there is clear evidence of harm from these platforms. And we know just intuitively and in so many ways that engaging in real world relationships, interactions with other kids, playing, that's what we need to thrive. And that's what kids have not been able to experience over the last decade.
Why is it not a good substitute, those digital relationships or in person?
The way that we think about the differences in between online life and real life interactions, there are two things to say. The first is that if we assumed that online life and real world life were the same, we would expect that there would not be a rapid change in how connected kids feel with each other. So if social media was a boon to making kids feel more connected with all sorts of friends and all sorts of ideas, maybe we would expect that loneliness among young people would actually get better. But in fact, we see the exact opposite. As kids have much more quantity of relationships, the quality of them are declining. They feel less close with their friends. They feel more lonely, more isolated, more disconnected rather than reconnected. And that is the big irony of the technological world. We're more connected than ever with so many more people, and yet we feel more alone than ever before. Um, and so for many reasons, it's not an adequate substitute. And just to point to a couple different features is that when we're especially online on smartphones and social media, our relationships tend to be asynchronous. So I post something and then I wait and then somebody else will like or comment on it and it kind of goes like that. It's also disembodied. I'm typically sitting in my room. I'm alone. I'm disconnected from other people. And I'm often talking when I'm online, not just to one other person, but I talk to one other person in the company of who knows how many people who are witnessing this interaction. And then my relationships are somewhat weak, that I can, if I meet somebody online in a Facebook group or something, I can close down that computer and that relationship is over. I might never need to deal with them or talk to them again. And so those four features are really crucial to understanding why it's so different, because in real world interactions, they're embodied. We're with people, we're physical, it's synchronous. We're talking, they're talking back. Um, we're talking with one other person or just a couple other people, and our relationships are stable and firm and they last for a longer period of time. And that's what kids really need. You need a small group of tight friends that you can have and you can depend on for a long period of time to really build those relationships.
What shocked you the most about the research that you did for this book?
What shocked me the most was how consistent the data trends were in terms of how young people are doing. I was shocked to see that kids in Australia are showing the same trends as the kids in the US and the same trends as kids in the Netherlands. I mean, we're seeing just this precise timing that right around 2012 in all of these countries, young people started to report feeling more lonely and disconnected and um, anxious and depressed. And just the consistency of that finding really is why we wrote this book, and that it really is a huge wake-up call. The second thing is just the hunger that we're seeing from parents, teachers, and even young people themselves, that the energy behind this book, this movement, and just these concerns about how our online lives are really depleting our social and our social health has been really striking. There are thousands and thousands of parents who have reached out to us, to reach out to other people who are starting their own groups, trying to really reset um, how we think about our children's relationships with technology and what that should be.
I want to go back to when you were talking about how girls were affected differently and more so, the most significantly. Why is it that girls are affected so much more by the social media harms?
So there are kind of two big things to say here. The first is just, when you try to understand why some product might be harmful to one group of people more than another, the first question you need to ask is who's using this product? And so when we look at platforms like TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, the people who use this product the most, who are most engaged, are adolescent girls. That's who like are among the primary consumers of those products. Boys are typically not using those products as much. They use more text-based platforms like Reddit, a lot of YouTube, but they're spending a lot of time playing video games. So just as an example, um, in 2015, this is almost a decade ago, just about 15% of American teenage girls were spending more than 40 hours a week on social media alone. So there's just an enormous amount of time. And this was 10 years ago. So just imagine what's happening now. So one is the quantity. And the second piece is that if you were to think about who your primary consumer is, and for social media, that is in many ways adolescent girls, you kind of intuitively start to design a product that kind of fits into the mold of what that consumer base wants. And that's the same for video games and pornography. It's shaped more towards boys. And so what is it that girls, especially adolescent girls, look for? It's a lot of um, relational based communication, gossip, different things that tend to lure girls in. And in many ways, they end up getting stuck there. And for boys with video games, it's very similar, that they have a deep hunger for agency and conflict and kind of war-based activities. And man, does Fortnite and Call of Duty speak to that. And that's where so many boys go. And then they get there, and then in many ways, they become stuck. And this is the key thing, is that these products lure kids in, and then they don't actually give the deep needs that they need to satisfy, like deep social relationships, like a deep feeling of competency and agency. Um, and then they get stuck there because that's where everyone else is. And so this is in many ways what we call a collective action problem, where because if you're a teenage girl, all of your friends are spending upwards of 5-6 hours a day on social media, well, there's nowhere else to go. And because of that, you stay there. And because of that, you want these products. And no parent wants to say no to their kid to either limit or take it away. And so we're stuck in this trap. And the big idea of the book is that in order to escape from this trap, we need to work together. And that's what the big solutions are to the book.
Is COSA right now being considered in Congress? Is that a step in the right direction? How would it help?
COSA is unbelievably important. COSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, is a bill that's been co-sponsored now by over 70 senators. COSA is extremely important because it's tapping into another area that's deeply problematic with social media and other online products, and that is the addictive design features that are made on these products. The companies themselves are in their own kind of collective action trap where everybody is competing with each other to create more dynamic, more engaging platforms to get more and more users. And when you don't have rules around, how young can you go for your users, really, you know, there were like millions of kids under the age of 13 who are on Instagram. Well, you have to continuously design your product to try to reel them in. And so what COSA sets up is it provides guardrails and limitations around what these products can do and the kinds of design features and settings that um, will be allowed for kids online. So if we're going to have kids spending 9 hours a day online, let's at least make sure that we have some basic parameters set up. And that's what COSA does. And it's really the first step, in our view, of a longer term project of rethinking what our kids' relationship with new technologies should be, how we want to integrate that in our lives. And right now, it's 24/7. It's all the time. And it's disrupting sleep, it's disrupting friendship, disrupting family life. And there's so much that we can do. Um, and it's time to hit the reset button.
What about the four foundational norms proposed in your book? Talk about those, please.
So the four norms are based in that idea of we need to act collectively. And so each one is about how do we escape from the collective action trap. And the first is that we recommend a norm of no smartphones until high school. So parents coming together with other parents of your kids' friends, and we say, okay, we're going to delay together to age 14 after middle school, because that's really where we're seeing the biggest harms coming from these products. The second, no social media until 16, so a little bit older, after trying to get after early puberty. The third is phone-free schools, which is essential for um, learning, for kids interacting with each other, in the hallways, in the lunchroom, or really calling for bell-to-bell phone-free policies. And then the last one is much more childhood independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. We have to do more than just take devices away. We need to remember the kind of childhoods that most of us had, which was full of interaction and play and engagement with other kids, and oftentimes not with our parents, because that is really where we learn to govern ourselves in the world. And so if we do those four norms, we think we can do quite a lot to reverse the trends that we've been seeing.
You were talking about the bell to bell and why that's important because, like, even if kids aren't allowed to use them in class, they're getting them out in the hallways on lunch break. So, again, they're missing that opportunity for that face to face connection. And in the book, you all talked about how even kids who don't have social media are then harmed by it because they're then missing out on that interaction with their peers because their peers are somewhere else.
Exactly. And, one of the things we've heard repeatedly from different school administrators and teachers, when schools go phone free for at least a few weeks, they start to say, we start to hear laughter again. We start to hear kids talking with each other. I mean, the lunchroom has gotten so quiet because, yeah, most kids are on their devices, and then those who are not are kind of isolated from each other. And so when we work collectively to reset these norms and not have this constant thing in our pocket that's constantly pulling us away from the people around us, and we give that space, we start to create a lovely, wonderful culture again with all of its strengths and limitations and problems. But that's what kids need. That's how we evolved as humans, is to be part of small groups and to engage over and over and over again. And that's how we learn to thrive.
I mean, it's obvious that this is happening to kids. What's happening to kids, like being elsewhere, always being somewhere else. I think in the book he says like we're constantly somewhere else, something like that. But I mean, really, that's happening to adults too. So it isn't a concern there. The bigger problem for teens is that it's happening during this like the foundational period where their identity is being formed. But talk a little bit about how adults are also subject to this, constant distraction and we're missing out on those relationships too.
Right. The most urgent public health issue that we have right now on this issue is among kids, because kids are learning. You got to learn to crawl, to walk, and then to run. And what we've essentially done is we've just put all this technology and not giving them the opportunity to learn to build those social skills and tools for them to really grow up and thrive. And so it's really urgent for us to to make sure that we are taking care of our next generation of kids. And so that's why we focus on children so much in this book. But you're absolutely right. The emerging new technologies that are becoming much more engaging and enticing is impacting all of us. And we kind of made a decision as a society generally, is that as adults we make our own choices. But what we really recommend is thinking about the same question of with our kids, which is, what do we want our relationship with this new technology to be? Is it actually helping us meet our goals? Or is our technology actually pulling us away from meeting our goals? Does it pull us away from interacting with our kids? Are we scrolling on our phones during dinner? Are we scrolling with our phones when we get a little stressed out and not learning just to be okay with those spaces of silence? I mean, there's so much that's happening that impacts all of us and all of our relationships. And what we really recommend is, like, how do we as adults be good role models and set good boundaries around our technology? Do we look at our phones as the last thing we do when we go to sleep and the first thing that we do when we wake up? I mean, all of us, I think, need to reset and think, is this how we want to live our lives? And is it disrupting different aspects of our lives? And um, how can we set those boundaries and parameters to live a more flourishing life?
There was another really interesting part of the book, and it just struck me so much. I wanted to ask you about it. Talk about the research, what you discovered about how disorders like Tourette's seemed to spread through something like social media online. Can you talk about those cases a little bit?
So yeah, the one of the big ideas in the book is the way that emotions spread online. And adolescence, I mean, if you just take a second to think back to what it was like to be in middle school as you're forming your identity, you're trying to form your sense of self. We're incredibly vulnerable to the people around us. And we know this in psychology in so many ways. I mean, we designed so much of our lives with the understanding that kids are very malleable. And one of the things that is true is that we are highly impacted by the emotions of other people. And we find that for girls, that's especially more true, that girls are very vulnerable to the emotions of other people and can start to take on those symptoms. And what we find generally is that this may be happening through social media as well. That as especially you have a platform that's driven by outrage and extreme content, that's what gets kind of uplifted and in our feeds over and over again. We can start to adopt some of the symptoms that we're seeing online as kids are expressing more extreme symptomology on these platforms. So that's kind of the big picture idea. That's a little bit more speculative, but it is quite a striking phenomenon of just, when you plug in millions of adolescents together in this viral outrage-based social media platform, it creates all sorts of unexpected phenomenon in the world.
Do you think we're in any way starting to see the pendulum swing back the other way?
100%. The hunger, not just from adults, but from young people. We're running a movement called Free the Anxious Generation, and we're working with about 8 different Gen Z organizations run by Gen Z, and they work with thousands of people individually. They work with thousands of people, each organization themselves. And when young people are reading this book, when they're thinking about the impact of social media, they want something else. One of the most striking studies that was done in 2023 looked at the cost of how much kids say that they, let me do that again. There's a recent study that asked college students how much they would pay to get off of TikTok and Instagram for a month. And the response in that study was $50. So quite a bit. But then they asked again, and they used the same question, but then they said, how much would you pay? How much would we need to pay you to get off of Instagram or TikTok for a month? But what if we got the rest of your campus to do so as well? And in that answer, they actually told the researchers that they would pay them. So the numbers went into the negative. And what that means is that these young people don't want these products to exist, but they can't coordinate with each other to get off of it. And so the pendulum is turning because people are seeing that essentially the emperor has no clothes, as the reference goes, that once you see that everybody else actually feels the same way as you, they don't want to be spending all of their days online. They want to be spending it with each other in person. And parents are feeling this, teachers are feeling this, young people are feeling this. And we do think that, over the next few years, we're going to see some really big changes in how we relate with social media in particular.
Thank you, Zach. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.